Good afternoon. Welcome to the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. I'm Tom Carruthers. I'm a Vice President for Studies here at the Endowment, and I'm the host and moderator of this meeting. Both President Obama and Secretary of State Clinton have stated, and I think they're quite sincere, a firm commitment to development as part of U.S. foreign policy. At the same time, despite those commitments, it's been a fairly slow road in the first part of this administration to explore and articulate a new development policy. As we know at USAID, it's been a slow process of getting a new team together, and they're still only in the midst of that. And there are two important review processes that are still underway that the government is carrying out, both the White House-led presidential study directive as well as the State Department-led quadrennial review. And so a lot of questions are still to be answered about where this administration would like to go on development. And that, of course, means that there are many questions still open for the Millennium Challenge Corporation, which is one important part of the U.S. development portfolio. John Huco asked in his paper, can the experiment survive? And it is an experiment. In a sense, when the MCC was created in 2004, it was an effort to leapfrog over a lot of existing bureaucratic practices on foreign assistance, both in the United States and a number of other donor countries, leapfrog towards a number of kind of aid effectiveness principles, like objective criteria for selecting recipient countries, taking country ownership seriously, taking a long-term approach to development, and so forth. And I think precisely because it's an experiment in trying to follow these aid effectiveness principles, it often comes under various pressures from other institutions in the U.S. government, other stakeholders more broadly in the U.S. policy community who question some of those practices. So I think basic questions about, has the MCC really been effective? What could be done to make it more effective? And where is it going to fit in what will be a changed U.S. development policy landscape over the next several years are all still wide open, even though we're well into the second year of the Obama administration. And we have a great group here to discuss that. First, we're going to hear from John Huco, who's the author of the paper that's inspired this event. John worked at the MCC really from its start in 2004 through 2009 as a vice president for operations there and was deeply involved in the negotiation of a number of compacts. He's a lawyer with a great deal of experience in the private sector who joined the MCC after having spent more than a decade abroad working as a lawyer in the former Soviet Union and Central Europe. We're going to hear next, after John, from Sheila Hurling, who's just joined the MCC as a vice president for policy and international relations. She came to the MCC from the Center for Global Development, which was doing some important monitoring work of the MCC during its first 6 years of operation. So she comes to the job with a great deal of experience from that perspective, and prior to that, many years of experience at the Treasury Department. And then we'll also hear from Darius Teeter, who's been at the MCC now for about 3 years. He's the acting vice president for compact development. So in a simple sense, we have just left, just joined, and been there a while. So those are three different perspectives on the institution. Now, John, in his characteristic fashion, has written what I think is a challenging and serious paper. And he's raised some hard questions, both that I think reflect his own personal integrity and honesty in asking hard questions about things that he did. But I promised Sheila and Darius that this is not going to be a screaming match. We don't do too much of that at Carnegie. On the other hand, we do want to try to pinpoint, what are really the key issues, and if disagreements arise, that's fine too. But this isn't a debate, it's a discussion. And I'm going to start by moderating a discussion among the three of them, but then I'm going to bring you in along the way. So if you start to accumulate questions and comments you want to make, you'll get time, and I'll bring you in once we get somewhat underway. So without further ado, John, why don't we take it over to you, and why don't you start by summarizing some of the main points that you think are most important here.
Thank you very much, Tom, and many thanks to Carnegie for your interest in my paper and for putting together this event. I think before I turn to my comments, I'd like to recognize really the enormous commitment and passion of the early pioneers at MCC back in those early years of 2004 and 2005. Building an agency from scratch is, while at the same time being asked to operate as if you're already a fully functioning agency, is an enormous undertaking. And for me, it was a real privilege to work with such a talented and dedicated group of colleagues. Again, it's not every day that you get to build an agency from scratch. It was tough. We had many spirited discussions and disagreements over operational and policy matters. That's normal. It's to be expected. But I think the success of the agency speaks for itself. And I think that all of us who were at MCC and those that are currently at MCC can be very proud of a tremendous achievement and of an agency which, in my view, has been a success. Now, Tom has asked me to limit my remarks to 10 minutes. And I'd like to sort of break up my remarks into two sections. First, to highlight what I think was the key challenge that we faced back in 2004 when we were creating the agency. Because I think it's a challenge that MCC still faces. And I think it's a challenge that MCC will need to overcome in order, in my opinion, to be able to reach its full potential. And then I'd like to focus on a few actions or suggestions that I think MCC and the new team should undertake. Clearly, Congress is an important player in this process, and in the paper I talk about a number of measures that I think Congress needs to think about. But again, in the interest of time, Tom, I think I'll just focus on those measures that I would suggest MCC consider. So what was our biggest challenge when we set up shop? I think it was the differing expectations that we felt or understood from Congress, the White House, the development community, the recipient countries, and even within MCC itself. In other words, the overall mission statement was very clear: to reduce poverty through the vehicle of sustainable economic growth. But there was a wide array, a disparate array of views out there as to how to operationalize that vision. And so on the one hand, we were being told to be bold, to take risks, to be innovative, and yet at the same time being told to make sure that every penny is being properly accounted for. By some were asking us to be transformational, get it right, respect country ownership, take your time, take a long-term view. Yet almost from day one, we were being exclusively judged on how quickly we signed compacts and how quickly we were dispersing funds. We were given no year authority. In other words, we could carry funds that we hadn't appropriated from fiscal year to fiscal year. And we weren't being earmarked. And that's great. But yet almost immediately we were being criticized for carrying unobligated balances over from fiscal year to fiscal year, and for signing too many compacts with infrastructure projects rather than with health and education. Some were telling us to do large compacts with a smaller number of countries. Others were saying do smaller compacts with a larger group of countries. And when you throw on top of this the tremendous oversight that we were subject to in the beginning, GAO, IG, Congress, and the fact that there were only 24 of us in the building when the agency opened, you can see that we were really being asked to deal with a set of expectations that were very disparate and contradictory in many cases. So what happened was a constant wave of unrealistic expectations and then a constant wave of continuing and evolving criticism. First, we weren't signing compacts fast enough. Then, not enough for health and education, too much infrastructure. Then you're dispersing too slowly. And then finally, I understand now you failed to provide transformative results in your countries. So I think this is the challenge that MCC still continues to face, and I think it's one that needs to be resolved in order for the agency to meet its full potential. So what would I suggest to my colleagues here that MCC consider going forward? And a lot of these issues aren't new. They've been discussed within the building for a long time. But I think the first one would be to address head-on this mixed expectations issue, and for the agency to come out and to clearly define its governing principles, to stick to those principles, even in the face of the expected criticism. And I would suggest that those governing principles include the following, say, 9 elements. First, MCC is a long-term investment. It will only show results in 7, 10, or perhaps 15 years. Second, it's inappropriate as a tool for near-term foreign policy objectives. 3, we need to temper our expectations about MCC. Yes, MCC is working with countries that have done well on its indicators, high-performing countries, but these are still poor countries with limited capacity to both design and to implement their compacts. So we need to temper our expectations in terms of what MCC is really able to achieve. Fourth, MCC compact implementation, compact design, and compact negotiation will take time. This is not a fast process. 5, infrastructure will continue and should continue to play a very important role in future MCC compacts. If the mission is to reduce poverty through sustainable economic growth, in my view, you can't do that without focusing on infrastructure. And it's not surprising that most of the compacts that have been signed to date have significant infrastructure components. 6, MCC will terminate compacts even if it means having a negative effect on other short-term foreign policy issues. 7, success should not be measured by the pace at which compacts are signed or at the rate of disbursement. It's not what MCC is all about. It's a long-term investment. It's going to bear fruit further down the road. 8, a limited number of programs will fail. As MCC becomes more innovative, as it begins using more risky models, it will have programs that fail. And that's to be expected. And finally, during implementation, compacts will be modified. They will have to be rescoped, particularly the ones that I was involved in, because we were under such enormous pressure in those early days to sign compacts that many of them were signed earlier than they probably should have been. And so it's not surprising that going forward you're going to be seeing a lot of rescoping and a lot of reshaping. And that's normal, and it's not, in my view, a failure. The second area I would urge MCC to focus on is the eligibility indicators. You have issues of data lag, floating medians, graduation from low income status to low middle income status, income biases. There's great volatility in country eligibility. 1 year a country is in, then it's out, then it's back in. And if I recall correctly, at one point, half of our MCC compact countries were failing on the indicators, which seems to imply almost a negative MCC effect. You become compact eligible and your performance declines. So I think this eligibility volatility and the volatility in the indicators needs to be addressed, and something I would urge MCC to focus on. Third, to utilize more innovative and riskier investment models. Budget support, guarantee funds, and a whole slew of other non-traditional, perhaps riskier models, but that have the potential of greater returns. No risk, no reward. But that will require that the stakeholders, Congress, GAO, IG, the NGO community, give MCC considerably more leeway, both to be innovative, to be creative, and to fail. Because it goes failure and high returns go hand in hand. You can't have one very often without the other. Fourth, I would urge MCC to consider modifying its model and the way in which it engages the private sector. I think the institution has done a very good job of getting the private sector involved in the initial consultative process, helping countries think through what should be the areas of intervention. But where I think we failed, I certainly failed, is to find a mechanism by which we could incentivize more upfront private sector investment. In other words, have a true MCC leveraging effect, rather than the private sector simply being the exit strategy for MCC, coming in after MCC, to find a way that MCC puts $300 million into a country, and right up front, the private sector is coming in with 200. That sort of leveraging effect we were not able to achieve, and it's something that if the new team can find a way to do that, would, I think, enhance considerably MCC's effectiveness. Fifth, provide earlier and more robust training to the MCA entities. And again, this is tricky because very often you don't know what the final projects are going to be until well into the due diligence process. So you don't want to be training people too early for projects that are not going to be funded. But I think some thought has to be given to finding an effective and efficient way to provide a little bit more upfront training to the compact eligible countries. And finally, I would urge MCC to eliminate the threshold program and to take the funds that are currently being used for the threshold program and allocate them to health and education. And I would suggest that this happen in the following manner. A country is chosen as MCC eligible. It immediately is given a grant of $25 to $50 million for health and education programs. MCC would have pre-cleared implementers that the countries could work with. The country would have 6 months to design a health or education program with the implementer. Money would be dispersed within 6 months, and the country would start working. And I think these pre-compacts serve a number of very valuable functions. One, it gets off the table this constant issue of not enough health and education. It's done. Right off the bat, we're spending considerable money on two very important areas. Second, we're able to disperse quickly, and it lessens considerably the criticism that MCC doesn't disperse fast enough. Third, the political leadership in the countries gets an immediate win. MCC eligibility resulted in a significant disbursement of funds for very valuable programs within 6 months of being deemed eligible. And finally, in my view, the most important consequence of this would be that the transaction teams, the teams that are actually negotiating the compacts with the eligible country, are now given some breathing space. They're no longer subjected to this relentless pressure to sign compacts because money's already been dispersed. There is already something that's on the table. So those would be some of the things that I would urge Sheila and Darius and the rest of the team to consider as they move forward. And thank you very much.
Good. All right. Sheila, let's start with you. You represent, to some extent, part of the new senior team that's come into the MCC and part of what I think will be an unfolding, not necessarily brand new vision, but a vision for what the MCC will be over the next several years. How do you react when you hear John's suggestions? Does it sound different from what you're thinking? And what's on your mind and the mind of the senior team?
Yeah, I will say, first of all, John, thank you so much for your paper. It's a huge contribution to both internal deliberations and external deliberations. To have more voices feeding into what we're going through right now is so important to our success, so thank you. And I will say that I was sort of struck as I read through the paper of saying, yes, absolutely, down many of his recommendations. And I think this is a good thing. I think what it actually shows is for people who were thinking that the MCC was a Bush flagship program that would go away with this new administration, or that this administration would come in and dramatically change the business model or the objectives of the MCC is wrong. And I think so that was nice to actually find that we agreed on so many things. And I guess I would say that I love the term experiment. I know that there were a lot of people, even internal to the MCC, who hated the title of your paper. I loved it. I constantly look at the MCC as the greatest experiment that the United States has given in the area of aid effectiveness, and I feel a lot of anxiety to make it work. A lot of the long-term principles you talked about that ground the MCC, we've been given so much flexibility to make it work, and if we don't, it has implications for the entire system. So I think all of us on the management team think very carefully about delivering on those principles. I think, John, a lot of the noise you talked about has died down. I mean, I feel that there is still a lot of, it's not so much criticism. I think that there has been a recognition of some of the obstacles that the MCC faced early on. And I think that there's been a recognition of the best practice principles that reside in the MCC, and these are heavily influencing some of the larger debates that are going on across the government, whether it's the Presidential Study Directive that you mentioned, Tom, or the Quadrennial Diplomacy and Development Review out of the State Department and USAID, that a lot of the best practice principles that reside in the MCC right now are heavily influencing the direction of the larger U.S. government effort, and so I think that's terrific. I guess I would comment on, you mentioned some of the best practice principles upon which the MCC model was built, and I don't need to repeat them. You both commented on them. But what I would say is that putting that model into practice has showed some real lessons, and John mentioned a lot of them in his paper. But I wanted to just comment on a few of them. One is that having a targeted objective, a singular objective of economic growth, and an independence as an agency helps an awful lot in conducting our business. We're not worried about meeting the competing demands of conflict prevention and diplomacy in its extreme and fighting terrorism. We're focused on one thing, and it helps an awful lot. Patience, investing in the long term really is a virtue. It's not in high supply in Congress. I think that remains true, although I think that many people understand the model more. Reality hits every year in the budget season, and I think this budget season is going to be a tough one, as is the next one. I think the next year will be worse. But I would say that there also is some room for optimism. I think that the Kerry-Lugar bill on foreign assistance reform, as well as Chairman Berman's efforts to rewrite the Foreign Assistance Act, all embody certainly the MCC's belief in focusing on the long term, particularly on measuring impact, not measuring disbursements, as you were saying. I think we still struggle with this in the appropriations process, but I think there's some encouraging progress on the Hill in thinking long term. The other thing is that, I agree, John, that there was an overestimated view of the capacity of the partner countries to design and implement these programs. They are very complex. They've put a lot of things into one 5-year package that needs to be delivered, and I think that was an overambitious view, and it's certainly challenging both our disbursement process, completing on time. There's a lot of completion risk. And also the fact that we have a small footprint. We have a 300-person cap in the MCC and 2 to 3 people on the ground. So it's certainly challenging that model. The other thing that maybe you didn't focus on so much on your paper, but that worries me, is sustaining policy reform. So one of the principles of the MCC, which is terrific, is that policies matter. It matters in how we choose our countries. We believe that it matters in sustaining our investments over time. And there is, I think, a good story to tell on what's called the MCC effect of countries really doing things to get into the club. The question is whether once they're in, we have any leverage in sustaining that policy reform. And so what we are experiencing is a bunch of our partner countries who have compacts are starting to fail the indicators. Now, the majority of them are not failing for any policy deterioration. So this will be another issue we'll talk about in terms of our indicators, but some of them are. And so it's a question of how do we either retool ourselves or leverage other US government agencies to think more clearly about policy reform throughout the life of the compacts, not just at eligibility. So the second issue I touched on was the impact of graduation, which you posit a notion that we should eliminate. We have a cap right now on how much money we can give to lower middle income countries. That 75% of our resources should go to the lower income countries and 25% should go to the lower middle income countries. And we have a cap on that of 25%. John recommends in his paper to eliminate that cap. And while I would love to see that happen, I think it's unrealistic. But what we are finding is a situation where countries have graduated. 42 countries over the life of the MCC have changed income categories. And what we're finding is the majority of the poor and the well-governed, which is this group of countries that we're supposed to be working with, are increasingly in the lower middle income category, where our funds are restricted to 25%. And this isn't because they are materially better off. They are not. If you look at the numbers of people living below $2 a day and the income level, it's hard for me personally, and I would love to hear your guys' view, to say that these countries are better off. And so we'll be facing that issue, and what is the right solution, I don't know, but we are right now talking to a lot of people in NGOs, many of you in the room I know we've talked to in the Hill, on how do we change the system to be true to our mission, keeping with the poor, but also the well-governed countries when this phenomenon is happening. But I suspect that the elimination of the cap is a non-starter on the Hill. It's a big leap of faith in the executive branch, although I personally know we would use it wisely. On the threshold program. So we are in the midst of an entire review of the threshold program, mainly because of a lot of the reasons that I'm sure John thinks, which is it's really hard to have the evidence that the threshold program has been the reason for bringing countries to pass the indicators, which was the logic behind it when it was designed. And so we're trying to look at it, see what it has accomplished, because it actually has, they have been good programs. They have accomplished good things, but they have not accomplished the mission that it was set out to do. And so we're doing a full review of that. I would challenge you a bit on and I hope we can talk about it, on your proposal, because it's hard for me to reconcile that with the no earmarks comment that you have earlier and the country ownership principle that underlies the MCC. And so, we should have a discussion of that, but I'm glad to have another idea in the mix on what to do with the threshold program. And I hope if any of you guys have ideas, we can talk about them here today. So maybe I'll stop there and hope that we have some good questions on the road ahead, and Darius will pick up.
John, rather than turn back to you, I want to hear from Darius, then I'll come back to you. Darius, you've been involved really in the nitty-gritty of some of the negotiation work by the MCC and in fulfillment of compacts. So what are some of the issues that are on your mind looking forward and also reading John's paper?
Yeah. Well, thank you, Tom, and also thank you, John. I used to work for John, and actually my first job out of university was at the Carnegie Endowment with Foreign Policy Magazine, so it's really great to be back here so many years later. Very quickly, I think about the challenge of developing compacts and how it touches on every issue that John raised. When you think about what we face when a country is made eligible, we have a set of criteria that we use to pick projects. Can it be completed in 5 years? Is it within the capacity of the sponsoring agency that wants to do the project? Are the environmental and social risks manageable? Does it yield an economic rate of return that's satisfactory to us? Are those returns distributed appropriately, to the poor? Is this really a true public goods project, or are we crowding out the private sector? And somehow you have to find a project that meets all of those conditions that no other donor has discovered in countries that often have 15, 20 donors running around. That's the most succinct way I can describe the challenge of trying to do a compact in a country that's meaningful. And in some countries, I've often asked myself, is the Venn diagram of that set of constraints yielding an empty set? And I think the answer is maybe if the only person you ask is the government. And that's a fundamental issue here. We have been perceived, and we have said that we are a reward to government for good governance. And as long as that's all we are, then we're going to be mainly asking governments for their ideas. And bless their hearts, we're in government. We work our butts off for low pay, but we don't necessarily have the best ideas in the world. The best ideas in the world are coming from outside often. So as I think about the challenge of compact development, I think about how do we broaden that? And MCC from the very beginning has been extremely dedicated to the principle of public consultation. And those public consultations happen and they're meaningful, but somehow we have to go to the next level. And so this is your point about engaging with the private sector more meaningfully and earlier. I take it fully on board because I've been all over the world at dinners with chambers of commerce, and they say, "Great, we're glad we're talking to you. We're glad you're talking to us, but can we submit proposals? What's the venue for us to talk to you?" And that's, I think, something we need to unpack. And our new CEO is going to have a retreat with his new management team in June, and one of the things that we've talked about is sort of rethinking some of the fundamental assumptions about how we do our business. And I read an article about 5 or 6 years ago from Harvard Business Review called The Passive-Aggressive Organization, and I happened to be working at one at that time. And what the passive-aggressive organization is an organization that's been around so long that it is incapable of changing itself because no one believes it's going to really happen. So every new leadership team comes in and says, we're going to change everything, and everyone's like, oh yeah, whatever. And they passively, aggressively make sure it doesn't happen.
That was after you left the country.
Right. That's actually why I left.
No, the Carnegie.
Sorry, not Carnegie.
And before you joined the
I didn't
MCC.
even get the joke. What I love about MCC, and it started from the beginning, and it's still true today, is the willingness to re-examine those assumptions, and that's the important part. So that's just the chapeau piece about the difficulty of compact development. With respect to your discussion point on the Hill. I've been going up to the Hill for the 4 key committees, so that's House and Senate authorizers and House and Senate appropriators, for 3 years now. And the tenor has changed. The tone, I think Sheila's right, the tone is much more positive. I think there's a clear understanding of what we're doing and why it's hard and the challenges of it. We need to get to the next step, though, because we are still seen as an easy target. And as long as we're an easy target, we're always playing defense. And as long as we're playing defense, it's always the next crisis. You didn't sign fast enough, you didn't disperse fast enough, you're not getting enough impact. We have put everything out there, our economic rate of return analysis, you can download it and test it, our beneficiary analysis, our monitoring and evaluation frameworks. And that's both, I think, a statement to the integrity of MCC. It's also a huge risk. Because when that data comes in, inevitably there's going to be bad information. Some of these projects will fail. Who will we be compared to? There's nobody to compare us to. Nobody publishes that kind of information. You go to the multilateral development banks and the projects are classified as wildly successful, highly successful, successful, generally successful, and partially successful. So, oh, great, you're hitting batting 100. So, that's my concern looking forward. Very quickly on some of your other points, I agree with Sheila about, can you have a project in a box that's a quick win when a government becomes eligible? The challenge of that, of course, is an education project in Indonesia might look radically different from an education project in Zambia, even if they both wanted to have a quick win education project. So I don't know how you design it. I don't know how you bid it out. I don't know how you have providers already on tap to do it. That's the first comment. I think the second comment is, and this is one of those fundamental things we need to rethink about, what do we actually mean by country ownership? It gets back to the who do we ask for project ideas. Fundamentally, we need to think about what we mean by that. In terms of taking on more risk and more innovation, I couldn't agree more. And the challenge is with, again, we have 260 staff right now. We have 40 vacancies. Please take note. And with that tiny footprint, how do we meaningfully, for example, put together a complex public-private partnership for infrastructure service delivery? Now, the IFC has 400 people to do that. And how do we do that between the year that the country is selected and the year that we've told the appropriators we're going to spend the money? It's like trying to put a possum through a python. I have to explain to the House Appropriations Committee exactly how much money I think we're going to need in 2012. And I have to do that this summer. And I have no idea.
Okay,
That's it.
Good. All right, let me just ask one general question to re-engage you all. We're 6 years into the life of the MCC, and that means over the next 2, 3, 4 years, results are going to start really coming in. In a sense, we've been in not the grace period, but in the rollout period. A lot of these compacts, now in a sense, coming home to roost. What do you think that's going to reveal? And how is that going to affect the MCC's position here in Washington and the debates about it? Because, realistically, as is true with most foreign aid, the hopes for being catalytic and transformative are going to meet the rubber of reality, and we're going to find that many of these countries have not transformed themselves yet. Probably people are going to feel on the inside that, hey, a lot of good was done through these efforts. Do you see that happening? And if so, what's going to be the reaction, and how are you going to handle that? Why don't you go ahead, Darius?
Well, I guess the first part is that we need to do a better job communicating what we're actually doing in these countries. People say, oh, you're building another road. Well, 7 months of the project development phase was convincing the government to actually create a real road maintenance fund, working with 3 or 4 other donors, using our leverage to finally get something over getting over the major hurdle to get the law passed, to get the fund created. In every one of our compacts, there's an untold story about the remarkable effort we used to try to leverage policy reform in the sectors with other donors. We're always a Johnny-come-lately, so we don't want to upset the apple cart if there's been a painful dialogue that the other donors have been working on, whether it's gender mainstreaming in how land titles are allocated or how you fund maintenance, or the classic one, a typical proposal is, please help us keep this state enterprise in business. Well, no, let's figure out how to take that state enterprise out of the business. That story we have to tell better, because that may not show up in the economic rate of return. It may actually be the hardest thing that we achieved. Mm-hmm. The second thing I would say is getting back, you're right, there's going to be some bad news. Let's remember 2006, 2007, the first half of 2008, huge commodity price boom, huge construction boom. The dollar was weak. In almost every project that we put out for bid, the bids were coming in double what we estimated. Well, that was also true with the World Bank. It was also true with the African Development Bank. It was true in the private sector. So our ability to tell that, not as a mea culpa, but, hey guys, these were extraordinary events that even a 25% contingency in your infrastructure project was not going to cover. But, as we all know, you can only get so far explaining why things happen. You have to talk about what you're doing differently. And I think we have a positive story to tell there. John was under, frankly, ridiculous pressure to push these compacts to signing. He did not have the time to do full feasibility studies. Plain and we've never hidden that. Everyone knows it. I think because we have fewer countries in the pipeline right now, we've been able to sort of take a little bit of time to do more feasibility assessments, more environmental impact assessment, more of the, frankly, I would say our costs are closer to like 80% of certainty. But even that luxury is slipping away. In order to do that, we had to delay, Moldova and delay Senegal until, frankly, after the fiscal year in which we had promised the Congress we needed those funds. It may happen in Malawi. It may happen, who knows, in Indonesia. So I think the story is explaining what happened, comparing us to what everyone else faced, talking about what we're doing differently. That would be my sort of three-pronged strategy.
Any comments on that, Sheila?
Yeah, I mean, I share a lot of what Darius has talked about, and we've talked internally about making sure that we better connect the full spectrum of our results. That I think the MCC has gone a long way in the last year in particular in getting more information on the website in terms of intermediate results. Because, of course, where we think the big bang for the buck is in our model is impact, but you've got to wait a while for that. Beyond the life of the compact even, or right at the very end. And so getting out better information on the intermediate results is important. But it's the point that Darius raised, which is one of the most influential things we do, is at the very beginning getting the policy change right so that the investments are sustained. Well, you can't see that when you go to the ground and look at the road. And so doing a better job on that, connecting the full dots would be important. I think, look, we've taken a calculated risk, as John did in the prior administration, of being transparent. And we have made that bet on the fact that it will pay off for us in the long run. But Darius' point that we don't have any comparators is going to be a tough one when it comes time to show some of the results. A reminder that some of the results are going to be great. They're going to be great. And so we will have that. But some of the results won't be what we started out with. And some of this is because it just didn't perform well. Some of it is that, as John recognizes in his own paper, these early compacts were rushed. Without the feasibility designs. We know a lot more now in implementation, and that's those ERRs are corrected, and as the M&E plans are corrected, they're on our website.
Yeah.
So it's out there, but I think as Darius said, we need to do a better job of getting that into the public domain and not relying on people coming to the site.
Shall we move on, or John, do you want to add anything on
I
that?
just wanted to say that for me, one of the values of having this robust and transparent M&E program that we put in place was really lessons learned going down the road. You're right, Tom. We will know in the next 4 or 5 years what some of these results are. And I think you're absolutely right, Sheila. There's going to be a lot of great results, but there's also going to be a lot of results that weren't what we thought. I think what MCC will do well on the output metrics, largely. It's on the outcome ones that I think, who knows. But that's all right, because part of this exercise was also a learning exercise to find out what works and doesn't work, and to present to the development community monitoring and evaluation programs that teach us what worked and didn't work. So even if we had a relatively large failure rate on some of this stuff, well, that's okay, because we now know what works and what doesn't work. And we always anticipated there'd be second, maybe even third compacts with these countries. So again, I look at all this as the tortoise. It's a long-term process, not Congress, 1 year appropriations, continuous election cycle. It's 10, 15, 20 years. If you take that perspective, then that changes completely the way you look at all these issues.
Let's come to the point of, John, you, in your paper and then again today, you mentioned some of the shortcomings of indicators and the puzzling phenomenon that with objective indicators, a country can actually become ineligible without actually changing simply because other countries change, and since they're relative indicators. But you don't really suggest how to do it differently. Do you stick to the principle of objective indicators, but imagine somehow arranging them differently, or do you think it's a deeper rethink in terms of the qualification process?
I think there has to be a deep rethink, but the rethink has to be framed in terms of the understanding that the indicators are never going to be perfect. They're not going to be perfect. You can't have that many countries all over the world, 90 or 100, 17 of them maintained by all kinds of different organizations that are going to be precise to the hour. There's data lag, there's all kinds of, there's bad data, there's data that comes in late. So I think that if one looks at these indicators as not being perfect, it does, and that's the premise that you start with, then you look at them slightly differently. But whatever you come up with, I would urge that it be flexible enough that, and everyone understands that some years countries may be up, they may be down, but whatever rules are actually come up with, that you apply them rigorously. So make them a little bit more flexible, make them a little bit more tolerant, but then say, that's it. And then if you slip below the median under the new system, then you're out. Because what we were having before was constant up and down, up and down, in, out, in, out.
That's a tough one. That's a tough standard to meet. I think I liked your first point best, which was these indicators were never meant to be everything. And I think it's the curse of having this really pretty scorecard that's green and red. And wow, people love that. They just love it. And but they were never meant to be everything. And so, I always remind people that in the legislation there are three criteria that go into the selection process, in the eligibility process. One of which is the indicators, and of course it's the predominant one. But they were proxies. They were best proxies for policy reform. The second is the ability to reduce poverty in these countries. That gets you looking more at the mix of where are poor people in the world. And the third is our budget. And that's a big one. That's a big constraint sometimes. So, so we are in the midst of a fundamental rethink for sure. Do we have the best available indicators with full coverage of all of the countries? It's a very hard standard to meet.
John, now that you're out of the government, I can put you a little bit more on the spot, which is how much has there been, to your mind, too much of a fourth on Sheila's list of three, which is just sometimes political pressure that we want to be nice to a certain government and we want to make them a compact country, even though by the objective indicators and the other two criteria Sheila mentioned, they wouldn't be. And is that a serious threat to the MCC, such pressures?
I think such pressures would be a death knell to MCC. I mean, it's absolutely critical that the process not be politicized, and that's why I think that if you work.
But you don't feel they've been that significant now?
Well, I mean, there were clearly always political pressures, and I think where it happened most was in the threshold area. That's why I was never really a big fan of the threshold program, because it was.
Because that's where when you're close,
you're close, and you can throw somebody $15 million, and it engages the country, and it's not a real commitment, yet it keeps it going. I know, Yemen, Mauritania, Niger. I mean, these countries have no business becoming. At that time, threshold countries, but they were. And I think those were a lot of political considerations went into it. I think on the compact side, I didn't sense a whole lot of that. I mean, the first year when we showed 16 countries, clearly Bolivia, Mozambique, and Georgia did not meet the criteria at the time, and they were let in any event. So that was some politicization there. But I think going forward, from then on in, I don't think any country was chosen as eligible that did not meet the eligibility criteria at the time it was chosen. And that's good, and it's got to keep that way, because as soon as you start politicizing the process, then you're back to square one.
But I would say on that one that, and Darius has actually experienced it more than I have, but watching it from the outside and now caring about it deeply on the inside, is that I think the board has moved to a much heavier emphasis on this ability to reduce poverty criteria, and are looking very carefully at the poverty rates in countries as they make those decisions. And if you put that filter on that, some of the countries that are in the mix now wouldn't have made it. And so I think that has been an interesting evolution in the thinking of the board, and partly forced by budget discussions, partly forced by experience, but I think it's been a nice evolution.
What about the other end of it, the termination process? A number of countries have been terminated. How much have political pressures weighed in on that process, do you think, John, or how much has termination proceeded?
Well, I mean, I think ADMC's done an admirable job in Nicaragua, Armenia, a number of other countries. Niger was eliminated from the threshold program. But I think they could have been tougher. I would have been tougher on Armenia. I think there was politics.
After the elections in 2008.
I think Armenia, there were other extraneous issues that went in the Armenia decision. And so it's not been perfect, but I would certainly hope that the current board takes a tough line on not letting politics enter into these decisions.
If I don't ask this, probably somebody in the audience will. Some people have argued in the Washington community here that there should be greater emphasis in the indicators or the qualification process on democracy as an indicator, and they look and say, look, Jordan's an MCC country. I thought this was supposed to reward democratic governance. Jordan's not a democracy and is not headed that direction. Why are they there? How do you feel about the argument that some make that democracy should be moved up and given greater weight in the process of deciding on eligibility? Sheila? John doesn't want to answer that.
I mean, I will say, at the time the MCC was started, I was at Treasury, where a lot of the work on the indicators was being done, and the thinking behind it, quite frankly, was with having 3 democracy indicators in a pool of 6, it would, in effect, become a hard hurdle. That didn't prove true in reality. I think it will be an issue that we look strongly at in this rethink.
Okay.
But Tom, if I could just go back for a second on this indicator issue and Sheila's point about how it's difficult to hold a tough line. And you're right. I mean, these indicators aren't perfect. But if you go out publicly and say, we know they're not perfect, and as a result, the standard is, and I'm just sort of off the top of my head, you have to be passing indicators when you become eligible. And then you're given 1 or 2 strikes. There's 1 or 2 years when we're going to expect you not to be passing the indicators. And that's not a problem. It doesn't all of a sudden become a cause for termination analysis or policy. We understand that you're going to have some fluctuation. But if there's more than 1 or 2 years that you fail, then you're out of the box. So you're giving countries some leeway because you understand the indicators aren't perfect, but you still do have yet a clear, bright line at some point that they need to know that if they cross it, they're going to be either terminated or suspended. And I always felt that the countries were starting to get the feeling that, especially that 1 year when we had half the compact countries that were failing, they were saying this isn't serious because the MCC gives you a second and a third and a fourth chance. So one needs to be creative. I don't have the silver bullet for you, certainly, but I do think that whatever you come up with, I would urge that there be some bright line because otherwise the process becomes less effective, in my view.
Yeah, I think it's a tough one. I mean, I think at selection, there aren't many cases where a country that failed were chosen besides last year with Indonesia and Philippines, and that was a graduation issue. That was, it's tough to say when Philippines, goes above the line by $35 and fails in the new income category because it's amongst a tougher peer that it has failed in its policy performance. And so those are tough ones. I think your issue on chance is when do they get a chance is when it really matters is when, in this case, second compacts will come up. And again, I mean, there aren't going to be cases I hope there aren't cases where countries get a second compact having failed the indicators. That I think has been a pretty hard line.
Mm-hmm. Darius?
There's an interesting intersection between this discussion and how you manage a bilateral relationship with an MCC-eligible country. Because we've gone out of the world where we had more funds than we had compacts. Now we have not enough funds for the pipeline of countries that we have. And if we really want to do all of the upfront feasibility, detailed engineering design work, it takes longer for them to get to the board. And in a highly fluctuating and unpredictable eligibility world, that's a high-risk environment. Both things, the funding risk and the eligibility risk, these countries look at this, and in particular because most of our countries are democracies, and they're wondering, am I going to get this compact while I'm still in power? And that puts enormous pressure on the pipeline relationship because we're saying, let's take this slowly, let's figure out what's the best thing to do, and let's study it fully carefully. And they're saying, no, let's move this thing along as fast as we can, and we'll figure it out after we sign. And that's where, we're in the compact development side, we are right in the middle of that. And the less predictability there is about the funding and the less predictability there is about eligibility, the more difficult it is to try anything innovative and risky in that environment because people are looking for the quick win.
Mm-hmm. Let me ask just a couple more questions, and I'm going to come to the audience. First, a question from a different direction, then I want to come to a really tough one. But it's my experience in traveling to other donor capitals is people are curious about the MCC, and they're curious whether it's working and what the experience has been. But I haven't seen much imitation yet. There is a general movement towards the same aid effectiveness principles throughout the donor world, but I haven't seen direct imitation and saying, we'd like to have a little, Dutch version of the MCC or that. Have you encountered interest from other donors directly, and have you seen efforts to sort of, some ways, imitate or reproduce some of the features of MCC, or do you think that the rest of the donor world is still kind of watching and waiting to sort of, in a sense, get a clearer sense of how this experiment has worked out? I'm curious if any of you have had much contact in that regard.
I was there in the early days, so it was obviously when we would go into the countries, and one of the first meetings I would have is with the donor community, and it was at that point of curiosity. How are you going to work? How are you going to work with the ID? How are you going to fit into the overall donor scene in countries? So certainly during my years at MCC, it was largely a learning exercise. What is MCC all about? And people wanted to sort of see what we were actually going to produce. I don't know, Darius, what you're sensing now in the field. Are people picking up and saying, gee, this is a great idea, or are they...
I get a lot of the, so you guys still exist. The sort of the wait and see, wow, this is really longer than we thought you guys would last. The other thing I get, and I'll probably reducing my future employability options, but there are some, particularly the multilaterals, that are resisting the kind of things that we're doing, actively resisting it. And now that they're all going through general capital increase negotiations, including with our U.S. Treasury, and they're being asked, a former colleague of mine from one of the MDBs was bitterly complaining that they were being asked to do more true impact evaluations with randomized project site selection and stuff like that. And they're not doing any. We're doing it for about 75% of our portfolio. And they're really resentful of that. Not so much of us, but just that they're being asked to, prove it.
Yeah,
and so I won't go so far as to say they're hoping we'll fail, but I think there's institutional, it's the whole passive-aggressive organization. There's institutional resistance to some of this. And then I'm struck by the Europeans. Our new CEO has met the heads of almost all the major bilateral agencies in the past 2 months, and I'm struck by they have much more funding certainty. They sometimes get 3-year funded, and yet they don't have to show as much of how they're doing it. I mean, you go all over Africa, and what you see is that it's the Europeans that are doing budget support. They're doing sector basket support. And not all of that is tied to very easily tracked indicators, or they're giving them a pass or a waiver, or letting them slide over and over and over again. And so I'm just struck by how important it is that we do survive, and that these principles, that we prove that it can be done, and that you don't just get punished for telling the truth. It's really important, because we are trying to be where other people should be trying to get to.
And some of them are. I mean,
some
I
of
would
them
say
are.
that,
Maybe I'm
in the
being too
case of the
negative.
DFIDs and Sweden, I think that they're saying, thank goodness the U.S. finally came up with something that's closer to what we've been doing and no works. And are pushing us to, as Darius is mentioning, sort of, when are you going to get innovative on your financing? You're basically doing projectized aid. So your innovation is all in the upfront selection, focus stage, M&E stage. But
It's still
but the finance is projectized. And so when are you going to get creative on the innovative finance? And I hope to see some of that in this new team.
Final question for me, then I'll start taking some from the audience. It's in a way one of the $64 questions here, which is that this is an administration which I think will prove over the years to be friendly to development and development aid. At the same time, it's an administration which has I think the ethos on development, or at least the president, of consolidation. It's a pretty wide spectrum of institutions in the U.S. government that work on development. If consolidation does become the order of the day, let me put it bluntly and put it to you, John, because I'm not sure it's necessarily easy for you guys to respond. Can the MCC survive in the form in which you'd like to see it survive if it's part of another organization and not an independent organization?
I've always been a very strong believer in the independence of MCC. And I frankly feel that MCC will fail in its mission if it were to be consolidated, certainly into state. That would be an absolute disaster. It would politicize the MCC immediately. And similarly with AID, because MCC has developed a unique, I'm not saying better culture, but a unique culture. And if it were subsumed within an AID, then we know who's going to win that battle in terms of culture and approach and methodology. So yes, Tom, I'm very concerned that MCC not lose its independence. I think the current structure has struck a good balance by having a board that includes the Secretary of State, Treasury, head of AID, and U.S. Trade Representatives. So you're getting a wide perspective at the sort of 15,000-foot level. But any loss of independence, in my view, would be a huge step backwards.
Okay. Let's turn to you out there in the audience, and questions and or comments, and you can either just direct them generally and I can steer them to people, or you can direct it to somebody else. Sir, and if you could introduce yourself. We have a roving mic. If you could just wait for a sec till the mic's in your hand, then introduce yourself and ask. Yeah.
Tony Carroll with Manchester Trade. A couple questions. Firstly, there's been a lot of debate recently about the possibility of regional compacts, that many of the infrastructure solutions don't end at borders, and there's some people who are saying, well, that's just because regional economic communities are left off the table and are not access to the funds, but others who do think that there are solutions there that do cross borders. And from the standpoint of leveraging private sector, John, I'm intrigued by doing more in the area of doing private sector leveraging. And I thought one of the missed opportunities throughout MCCs was the extractive industries, working with extractive industries and trying to develop with country consent infrastructure solutions that not necessarily get them off the hook, but allow them to concentrate on what they do and at the same time participate both in financial and other technical areas in developing infrastructure that may be related not only to their project, but perhaps the environments in which they operate.
Thanks. Could either Sheila or Darius say something about regional compacts? Yeah, Darius.
I'll take a shot at that one. In my previous incarnation, I worked on the Central Asia Regional Economic Cooperation Initiative in the Asian Development Bank, which was looking for regional power projects, regional road projects. And there were very few actual projects with two signatory countries. It was usually, we agree that the roads connect there, we'll pave that one, we'll pave that one. The real wins were on customs integration, the barriers to trade, because you can all agree where the road goes. Power sector in Central Asia was much tougher, because of, when the Soviets built out that system, there weren't any borders. So you would have generation there and transmission there, and you had to reconfigure who bought what from whom. In And Southern Africa is probably the place where you'd see the most opportunities with Tanzania, Mozambique, Zambia, Namibia, Malawi, I mean, all touching each other. But again, each country became eligible at a different time. Their compacts were on a different timeline. So having a formalized regional project with multiple signatories, it's extremely tough if you're an MDB. I would say it's that much tougher for us. That doesn't preclude you from encouraging your partner countries to think about how, in the things that they ask us to do, how those are linked. And we do get that. In the case of Malawi, they asked us to fund the rehabilitation of 524 kilometers of their rail line, which would connect them to Nacala. That project was just more than we could bite off and chew in a five-year timeline. There's a project in Zambia that's been proposed to us, which is, this gets to your extractive industries point. It's the Copperbelt Power Company, which is an independent consortium, wants to do a hydropower project, and they're looking for us to participate. Again, exciting possibility, but once you bring in our environmental and social requirements, I'm not sure that the project sponsors would really welcome that. So those are the kind of nitty-gritty challenges of trying to make these absolutely desirable objectives work in a U.S. Bilateral government-funded operation. I think that's the principal challenge that the new CEO has put to us is, don't tell me why we can't do it. Let's figure out a way that we can do it, and that is very much on the top of his agenda.
Mm-hmm. John, any comment about his question or comment about the private sector and extractive industries?
Well, I think the problem with the extractive industries is it raises all kinds of alarm bells. And there are people in the groups in the stakeholder community who view that. I remember in Salvador when we were building the road in the north, there are certain groups that are saying, oh, this is really designed to allow the mining industry to get in and exploit that part of the country, which wasn't the case at all. So those are very emotional, hot-button issues, but that's exactly my point, that we need to get over that and realize that well-done extractive industries projects or large infrastructure projects, properly done, are going to bring enormous benefit to these countries. Now, on the regional issue, you raise an interesting point. For example, I think we lost an enormous opportunity, the United States government, not necessarily MCC, but the government did, in Central America, where we had at one point Maduro, Bolaños, Berger, and Saca, Salvador, Guatemala, Nicaragua, and Honduras, four presidents who were pro-market, pro-Western. And it's at that point, if we had vision, and it's very difficult to do today in the United States, I would have gone to those four countries and said, okay, we're going to give you $5 billion. You've got a year to sort out all your interregional problems, border, customs, enforcement, judicial decrees, whatever it is. And then we're going to give you $5 billion on MCC principles for you guys to use for projects you think you need for integration. Now, when I brought that up with people, they go, you're out of your mind. You're never going to get that kind of money. And the sad thing for me was that when that region deteriorates, if it ever does, we'll throw $50 billion at the problem. But we can't throw $5 billion, or I'm just making the number up, but we can't throw that kind of money at it at the beginning when we have all the stars lining up. And those stars are now gone, unfortunately, in that part of the world. So I think there's a lot of room for regional stuff. How you operationalize it, make it happen in the Washington reality is, of course, a whole different ballgame.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in the back here, and then I'll come to you. Yeah.
By coincidence, Steve Landy, Manchester Trade. We appreciate that. But to go back a moment to the regional integration program, many of us do not understand what MCC is doing. There is unbelievable support now in the private sector, the NGO community, for a regional approach in Africa. We have made a lot of progress both in East and Southern Africa with the tripartite agreement that will eliminate the problems. West Africa still remains very close to agreement between Francophone countries, Nigeria, Ghana, etc., to get ECOWAS moving. Question very specific. When I go to my friends at MCC, they said, oh, we love regional integration. The problem is that Congress is opposed to it. When I go to Congress, they say, oh, Congressman Payne, others, they're on record favoring regionalism, but MCC tells us they can't do it. If you're such a creative organization, I can come up with, Tony came up with an idea, Carol, saying 20%, you tell a country you win, 20% should go to a regional project and so on. And there's other ideas. What are some creative ways to deal with it? Maybe it involves modifying your compact a little bit and so on. And I can guarantee you that if you have ideas that get some publicity, the private sector or key organization, the private sector and NGOs will support what we have in the mind. At the moment, we are ceding our position in the regional economic community to Europe because we do not have an ability to deal with their coercive methods or with the amount of money, as somebody pointed out, you're throwing into the project. Anyway, that's my challenge. I'm be interested in your results, in your reaction. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe I can just comment quickly. Probably not very satisfying because we're still, in a deliberative stage with the new team, but it is something on our minds. I think where we get in the back and forth in Congress isn't necessarily over a disagreement over a focus on regionalism and the benefits of regional approaches. It's that, do we have a capacity internal to the MCC to do regional compacts? So it becomes this technical, legal question. That doesn't mean at all that we shouldn't be thinking regionally about our investments. And I do think this is something that's on the mind of the CEO. He's also very committed to doing more outreach specifically to the private sector and NGOs to get ideas in this interim stage. So I will put this, again on the agenda. It's already there. But the whole point is to get these ideas on the table.
Well, and if I could respond, your proposal was, okay, you're eligible for a compact, but 20% of that has to be for regional projects. Well, how do you know it's not already? I mean, how are you defining a regional project? If a country wants us to help them repair their road to the border and fix their customs port, does that classify as a regional project that satisfies their 20% requirement?
Very simple reaction in one sentence. That's why you begin to work with the regional economic communities, the RECs. That's why you begin to work with the RECs. You set up a consultation mechanism. You put in some tests. When I was talking about creativity, that's the kind of question I'm sure you could answer if you were sitting in a group. Now we can't answer it, sitting here, with 15 other people wanting to ask questions.
Okay, fair enough. Let's go on. I've got you, and please be as challenging as possible. These guys are very consensual and
thanks, Tom.
technocratic, and let's stir them up a bit if you can.
Hi, Harvey Sloan. I'm with a small NGO, the Eurasian Medical Education Program. We're in partnership with the American College of Physicians, 136,000 docs to volunteer to go over to host countries. And we've been working in Russia now for 13 years. I have two. First, I want to say that I'm really an MCC fan. I think MCC and PEPFAR really are two of the great initiatives out of the last few years, and we're going to see more in this administration. I have two experiences, one in Moldova, and it was a very good experience. I thought they were well organized, the field staff. They put us in a place where we were productive, and we worked there about a year, and it was very significant and I think satisfying. The second one has been with Mongolia.
Sorry, they is the Moldovan government, or they is our team?
Oh, your team.
Uh-huh.
And you had a very good staff there, and they were organized. It was very impressive. In Mongolia, which we've been interested in now for over 2 years, we have just found one difficult situation after another. I think they got their award 3 years ago. There's yet to be some contracts, RFPs going out in health. We've organized, we're a small group, but we've organized with universities and what have you, and it's very difficult. The RFP was almost impossible to understand. And we lost a bunch of partners because they said it's too confusing. Can't you all give a little more expertise in health, if you want your threshold money to go partly for health? But you got to have some on-the-ground expertise to make it work.
Okay, quick response, Darius.
Yeah, on the Mongolia, I actually lived in Mongolia for 4 years. The Mongolia Compact includes a project on adult health. Typically, we're funding, most donors are funding primary health, prenatal care, or HIV/AIDS health. This is an interesting project because it's dealing with adult diseases like diabetes and heart disease, which is a huge killer and a big drag on the workforce. So I'm presuming that's the project you're talking about. I can't comment on the specifics, although I can put you in touch with the people that you probably need to talk to. But what you're pointing out to me is one of the other challenges of MCC's model, which is that we expect our countries to implement these projects. We have 2 people on the ground. We have a lot of financial resources to help them, but at the end of the day, we're not writing these RFPs for them. We're asking them to do it, and we're trying to help them. And this is what it looks like around the edges. It looks rough, and especially the first couple of years, it looks rough. So it's not really an apology. It's a statement of fact that it's our greatest challenge. And I think you're right that it's how do you figure out who you're going to work with before you've signed the compact and start giving them the help and the capacity that they need to do this kind of implementation professionally, as opposed to doing it for them, which is what a lot of other folks are doing.
Okay, I'd like
I
to.
already got a thought. We're 3 years into the proposal, and they're going to have to stop in year and a half, whatever it is. They're going to lose services.
Okay.
Not going.
Yeah. All right. Let's take a couple more, then we're going to finish up. Yes, right there.
I'm Jake Dezard from Freedom House. And I wanted you mentioned there needs to be a willingness to terminate or suspend compacts, and you also talked about the need for flexible yet rigorous rules. I'm wondering where democracy would play into compact termination or suspension. Relatedly, now that there have been a number of countries that have experienced real political democracy and rule of law related turmoil, Nicaragua, Honduras, Yemen, etc., Armenia. I'm wondering what's happened with the lines of communication to the people who you worked with for years to put together the threshold and compact programs in order so that if things do start to improve, which is possible in some cases, though unlikely in others, at least from our data, all the conversation about policy reform and how to sustain it, how to bring it back, isn't lost completely in the meantime.
Okay. Who'd like to? John.
Well, in terms of the comment on the democracy, I mean, there was a big debate when I was there, and I don't know, I'm sure you're having it still. And Tom, you posed that question, is within the 6 ruling justly indicators, there are 3 that focus specifically on democratic issues. And a country like Jordan has been consistently failing those 3. So there's always a policy question. Do you have a sort of sub-test that you have to meet, that not only do you have to pass 3 of the 6 indicators in the ruling justly, but you can't be failing the 3 democracy ones. And that's a tough one, and I don't have an answer for you. And my heart says that you should have that subtest, because at the end of the day, that's a very fundamental key principle that I believe in. Whether that's realistic in terms of 17 indicators and then focusing on those 3 in particular, I don't know, and I don't know where you stand, Sheila, on that question right now.
Yeah, I mean,
it's
we
not an easy one.
we talked about it earlier, and it is absolutely one of the key issues that we're looking at as we open up the entire selection round. And I think if you look at the record of countries in the last couple of selection rounds, you won't see any choices that failed all 3 democracy indicators. And so this was back to my point on the board putting a higher scrutiny on this. And you get a lot of flack. There are some countries that fail those 3 indicators now that still pass the indicators, have had threshold programs, and aren't getting chosen despite that. So that will be something that we're looking at carefully going forward. And on the terminations, I mean, frankly, most of them have been over democracy issues.
Yeah.
And what about the lines of communication?
What are you referring to? You have something in
The
mind? when
lines
you
is a
said-
tough one because
governments put in so much effort lobbying us and lobbying all the other groups and talking, obviously, negotiating compacts and thresholds. And there are people who put in years on this, and then what happens when they're terminated or suspended is all that conversation just disappears.
Darius?
A couple of comments on that. First of all, with the exception of Madagascar, which was shut down, Niger, on hold, but some of these compacts, the board took actions that allowed some of the funds to continue to flow and others to stop. So we still have a relationship. The second thing is, and this is true of big infrastructure projects, it's hard to turn the spigot off because you can't leave a half-finished project. It's dangerous. Plus, there's huge cost to unwinding those contracts. It's equally hard or harder to turn the spigot back on. So you could say, okay, Honduras is now back on, but there's very real contracting and programming and construction implications of that. And so to the extent that we want to continue to have the MCC effect and to encourage the countries to think about their policies, it's not clear that we can have a big promise of cash behind that. So that it really has to be something that the countries want. It's, the spigot is just hard to keep turning on and off.
Good. Sheila and Darius, we're running out of time, so I want to close. But I want to say that, the new leadership really is at a crucial time. The administration's starting to really get underway on development policy. MCC really now has an opportunity, for a second phase to define itself and put itself forward in the policy community in a way that's effective. And I'd just like to say, I think the spirit of this meeting is we care and we hope it moves forward successfully. We're also watching, and we'll continue to put our own 2 bits in from the outside in that process, but we wish you well. You have been a consensual group. That's because you all believe in the same thing, which is you think the
We had a
MCC
couple
is a
disagreements.
valuable organization that, at root should keep having a distinctive place in the U.S. policy landscape. And so I appreciate the spirit of that, and thank you all. And John, again, thanks for the excellent paper and your work and your honesty in coming forward with these issues. Thanks to all of you, and we look forward to seeing you again.